The story of Japanese women in Soviet captivity is ultimately a story about the human cost of empire and war, about how ordinary people become trapped in forces far beyond their control, and about how suffering can be compounded by silence and shame. These women were not soldiers or policymakers. They did not start the war or make strategic decisions. They were teachers, nurses, wives, daughters, sisters, trying to live their lives in circumstances they did not choose. What happened to them was not their fault, yet they bore the consequences their entire lives. Their story also reminds us that victimhood and national identity are complex. Being Japanese did not protect these women. Indeed, their Japanese identity made them targets. But it also later complicated their ability to seek recognition, as their suffering was often dismissed or ignored because of other Japanese war crimes, as if human beings can be collectively guilty and therefore undeserving of compassion. This logic, which pervades so much of how we think about war and justice, needs to be challenged. Individuals deserve to be seen as individuals, their suffering acknowledged on its own terms. In the final accounting, perhaps what matters most is bearing witness, ensuring that these women's experiences are not forgotten, that their voices, however belatedly recorded, are heard. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics or political abstractions, but as human beings who endured unimaginable circumstances with courage and dignity. Their survival itself was an act of resistance, a refusal to be completely broken by the empires that tried to crush them. The last known survivor of these detention centers passed away in Japan in 2019 at the age of 96. She had never married, never spoken publicly about her experiences, and lived quietly in a small city on the northern island of Hokkaido. When her niece was sorting through her belongings after her death, she found a diary, pages yellowed and ink faded, documenting her months in captivity. The niece donated it to a historical archive where researchers could preserve and study it. In the diary's final entry, written shortly after her return to Japan, the woman had recorded a simple statement that somehow captures both the horror and the resilience of her generation. "We survived," she wrote. "That will have to be enough." And perhaps it will have to be enough, knowing that they survived, that they carried impossible burdens with grace, that they maintained their humanity in inhuman circumstances. Their story, tragic and uncomfortable as it is, deserves to be told and remembered. Not to foster hatred or resentment, not to fuel nationalist narratives, but to honor their suffering and to remind ourselves of the countless ways that war destroys lives, especially the lives of the most vulnerable. These women were lost between empires, but they need not be lost to history. In remembering them, in speaking their stories, we perform a small act of justice, however late it comes. Support groups began forming in Japan in the 1980s and 90s, quiet gatherings where survivors could finally speak truthfully to others who understood. These groups provided crucial spaces for validation and healing, even coming so late in the women's lives. Many survivors reported that simply being believed, having their experiences acknowledged as real and significant, provided relief they had been seeking for decades. The act of bearing witness to each other's pain became its own form of resistance against the historical erasure they had endured. The story of these women also intersects with broader questions about how societies remember war. Nationalist narratives on all sides tend to emphasize their own suffering while minimizing or ignoring the suffering they caused. Japan's wartime atrocities in Asia were enormous and well documented, yet Japanese society has often been reluctant to fully confront this history. Similarly, the Soviet Union cultivated a narrative of purely heroic struggle against fascism, leaving no room for acknowledging crimes committed by Soviet forces. The women caught between these empires became casualties of both the violence itself and the subsequent battles over historical memory. Some contemporary feminists and peace activists have adopted the stories of these women as cautionary tales about the particular vulnerabilities women face in wartime and the ways patriarchal systems fail to protect them or acknowledge their suffering. The phrase, women's bodies as battlefields, has been used to describe how female civilians become targets and terrain in conflicts they did not create and cannot control. These survivors' experiences provide stark illustration of this dynamic, showing how women's humanity is erased in the machinery of war and empire. Education about this history remains limited. Japanese textbooks mention the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the detention of Japanese prisoners of war, but the specific experiences of women are rarely detailed. Russian education similarly glosses over or ignores these events. The result is that new generations grow up without understanding this chapter of history, unable to learn from it or honor those who suffered through it. Some educators and activists are working to change this, developing curricula and materials that center women's experiences of war, but they face resistance from nationalist forces who see such discussions as unpatriotic or damaging to national honor. The few monuments and memorials that exist are often small and unofficial, created by survivors' families or local peace groups rather than governments. In Japan, a small memorial stone in the park in Fukuoka bears an inscription remembering all who suffered in the chaos of war's end, a deliberately vague phrase that nonetheless provides a place for some survivors and their families to gather and remember. In Russia, there appears to be nothing, no public acknowledgement that these events occurred. As we move further from World War II, as the last survivors and even their children pass away, the risk of this history being completely forgotten grows. Historical memory is fragile, dependent on active effort to maintain and transmit. Without continued research, education, and commemoration, the experiences of these women may disappear entirely, reduced to footnotes if mentioned at all. This would represent a final betrayal, allowing them to be victimized yet again by historical erasure. The exact numbers remain uncertain. Soviet records were never made fully available, and many documents were destroyed. Japanese records are incomplete, focused primarily on military personnel rather than civilians. Estimates suggest that between 50,000 and 100,000 Japanese women were detained by Soviet forces in Manchuria and other occupied territories. Of these, perhaps 10 to 20,000 experienced extended captivity and systematic sexual violence. Thousands died in detention from disease, malnutrition, violence, or suicide. But these numbers can only be approximations, and the full scale of the tragedy may never be known. Some women never made it home. They died in captivity, their graves unmarked, their families often never learning what became of them. Others married local men in China or Korea, unable or unwilling to return to Japan, building new lives among the ruins of the old. A few were taken further into the Soviet Union, their fates unknown. The missing remain missing, their stories untold except in the memories of those who knew them, and in the gaps in family histories where their names should be. The children born from these rapes faced their own struggles. In Japan, those who were visibly of mixed heritage encountered discrimination and difficulty finding acceptance. Some mothers gave them up for adoption, unable to care for them or unable to look at them without remembering their trauma. Others raised them with fierce protective love, determined that their children would not be defined by the circumstances of their conception. These children, now elderly themselves, carry their own complex relationship to this history, trying to understand their origins while honoring their mother's suffering. International law and human rights frameworks were still developing in the immediate post-war period, and the concept of sexual violence as a war crime was barely recognized. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal prosecuted Japanese officials for numerous atrocities, but Soviet crimes against Japanese civilians were never addressed. No one was held accountable for what happened to these women. The Cold War divide that emerged immediately after World War II made any serious investigation or justice impossible.
The Soviet Union was now an ally against communism's spread, at least from the American perspective, and Japan needed Soviet goodwill for various diplomatic reasons. The women's suffering was sacrificed to geopolitical convenience. In recent decades, some Japanese activists and scholars have pushed for recognition and apology from Russia, the Soviet Union's successor state. These efforts have met with limited success. Russian officials have generally denied that systematic sexual violence occurred or have deflected by pointing to Japanese war crimes, including the use of comfort women, as if one atrocity justified another. The few official discussions have been carefully worded to avoid accepting responsibility. Meanwhile, the survivors have aged and died, taking their full stories with them. The parallels to Japan's own use of comfort women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories are uncomfortable but unavoidable. Many survivors of Soviet captivity struggled with this irony, the realization that their suffering mirrored what Japanese forces had inflicted on women across Asia. Some became advocates for all victims of wartime sexual violence, using their own experiences to demand justice for comfort women. Others found the comparison too painful or politically fraught to address. The moral complexity of being both victim and representative of a victimizing nation created psychological and ethical tangles that some women spent their entire lives trying to navigate. Matsumoto Keiko, who was held in a detention center near the Soviet-Manchurian border for 8 months, became one of the few vocal advocates for recognition. In her 80s, she gave a speech at a conference on wartime sexual violence in which she directly addressed this complexity. "I do not ask for sympathy because I am Japanese," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "I ask for recognition because I am human. What happened to me happened to Korean women, Chinese women, Filipino women. We were all victims of empires that treated women as objects to be used. If we only care about our own people's suffering, we learn nothing. We deserve better. All of us deserved better." The psychological research on these survivors, limited though it is, reveals patterns consistent with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The women who survived often exhibited symptoms decades later: nightmares, hypervigilance, dissociation, difficulty with intimacy, and what one researcher described as a fundamental loss of trust in the world. Many never fully recovered psychologically, even those who built outwardly successful lives. The inability to speak openly about their experiences compounded their trauma, denying them the possibility of social support or therapeutic processing.
As months passed, the situation grew more complex. The Soviet Union and its allied Mongolian forces were transforming Manchuria into a stripped industrial zone, dismantling factories and infrastructure to ship back to rebuild Soviet territory devastated by the war. Japanese prisoners of war were being sent to labor camps throughout the Soviet Union, where they would work in mines, forests, and construction projects, often in conditions that resulted in thousands of deaths. But the women remained in a kind of limbo, neither fully processed as prisoners nor released. Part of the delay came from diplomatic complications. Japan had surrendered unconditionally, but the specifics of repatriation, especially for civilians in Soviet-controlled territory, remained murky. The United States, which occupied Japan proper, pressed for the return of Japanese nationals, but the Soviet Union was in no hurry. Stalin saw value in maintaining leverage over Japan and in using Japanese labor to rebuild Soviet infrastructure. The women became pawns in this larger geopolitical game, their fates dependent on negotiations between powers that saw them as abstractions rather than human beings. Some women attempted to escape, despite the enormous risks. The distances were vast, the terrain hostile, and they lacked resources, maps, or any clear destination. Most who tried were quickly recaptured, often facing severe punishment. But a few succeeded, making their way through Soviet lines into American or Chinese nationalist-controlled areas, or managing to blend into local populations. Their stories of survival became legendary among the remaining detainees, whispered tales of hope that kept spirits alive even in the darkest moments. Gradually, starting in late 1946 and extending through 1948, repatriation began. Ships carrying Japanese civilians, including many of the women who had been held in Manchuria, arrived at ports in Japan, disgorging passengers who looked like ghosts, thin, traumatized, and bearing the marks of their ordeal. But their return home brought new challenges. Post-war Japan was itself struggling. Cities destroyed by American bombing, the economy shattered, food scarce, and society trying to rebuild both physically and psychologically from devastating defeat. The women who returned found themselves facing not sympathy, but often suspicion and shame. The cultural stigma attached to sexual violence meant that many could not speak openly about what they had endured. Families sometimes rejected daughters or wives who had been contaminated by foreign soldiers. Potential marriage prospects evaporated. Some women discovered they were pregnant, carrying children conceived through rape, facing agonizing decisions about what to do. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, but raising a child who would be visibly of mixed heritage in a homogeneous and traumatized society seemed equally impossible. Many women simply buried their experiences, never speaking of them even to close family members. They married if they could, often hiding their time in Manchuria or fabricating alternative stories. They had children and tried to build normal lives while carrying immense psychological burdens in silence. The shame culture that governed post-war Japanese society made it nearly impossible to seek help or even acknowledgement. The government, eager to move forward and not antagonize the Soviet Union, showed little interest in investigating or documenting what had happened to these women. They became invisible victims of a war that everyone wanted to forget. It wasn't until decades later, as some survivors reached old age and Japanese society began more openly discussing wartime experiences, that fragments of their stories began to emerge. A few brave women decided that the truth needed to be told, even if it brought them shame, even if their families objected. They gave interviews to researchers, wrote memoirs, and testified before government committees investigating wartime suffering. Their accounts revealed a tragedy that had been hidden in plain sight. Thousands of women who had been victimized not once but twice, first by their captors and then by their own society's refusal to acknowledge their pain. Historian Yamada Keiko, who has spent years documenting these women's experiences, explains the multiple layers of their suffering. These women were caught between empires in the most literal and devastating way, she notes in her comprehensive study published in 2010. They were victims of Japanese imperialism, sent to occupied territories to serve an expansionist agenda they had little choice in. They were victims of Soviet revenge and lawlessness during the occupation. And then they were victims of Japanese patriarchal culture that blamed them for their victimization. They had no advocate, no one speaking for them, no recognition of what they endured. They simply disappeared from history. Nurse Tanaka Yoshiko was working at a field hospital in Harbin when Soviet forces arrived. At 28, she had already spent 3 years in Manchuria, caring for wounded soldiers and believing in the mission she had been taught since childhood. "We heard them before we saw them," she recounted in her memoir, published privately in Japan in the 1970s. "The rumble of tanks, the shouting in a language we couldn't understand. Our hospital administrator, a colonel, gathered us together and told us to remain calm, that as medical personnel we would be protected under international law. But when the Soviet soldiers burst through the doors, they weren't interested in conventions or laws. They were interested in conquest." The women were rounded up systematically, separated from any remaining Japanese men who were immediately designated as prisoners of war bound for labor camps deep in Siberia. But the women's status remained ambiguous, trapped in a bureaucratic and moral gray zone. Were they civilians to be repatriated? Were they enemy nationals to be interned? Or were they simply spoils of war, to be used and discarded as their captors saw fit? The Soviet authorities seemed uncertain themselves, and in that uncertainty, the women suffered. They were herded into makeshift detention centers,
often former Japanese military barracks or warehouses where conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food was scarce, medical care virtually non-existent, and the threat of violence constant. Many women were forced into what amounted to sexual slavery, held in so-called comfort stations established by Soviet military authorities, a bitter irony given Japan's own use of comfort women throughout its occupied territories. The Soviet Union never acknowledged these facilities in any official capacity, and many records were destroyed or classified. But the testimonies of survivors leave no doubt about what occurred. Kimata Sachiko was 17 when she was taken to such a facility in Mukden. The youngest of 3 daughters of a railroad administrator, she had been preparing to return to Japan for university when the Soviet invasion began. Instead, she found herself trapped in a nightmare that would last for months. "They told us we were being taken to a safe place, that we would be fed and protected," she testified before a Japanese parliamentary committee in the 1990s, one of the few survivors willing to speak publicly. The safe place was a former hotel where they had locked all the exits. Every night, officers would come. We learned quickly not to resist, because resistance meant beatings or death. Some girls chose death anyway. I understood why. The psychological toll was immense. These women had been raised in a culture that placed enormous emphasis on female purity and family honor. To be violated in such a way, to be rendered what Japanese society would consider impure, created wounds that went far beyond the physical. Many contemplated or attempted suicide, seeing death as preferable to the shame they would carry. Others dissociated, their minds protecting them by creating distance from the horror their bodies endured. Some found small acts of resistance, sharing food, comforting each other, maintaining their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. But beyond the sexual violence, there was also the grinding daily reality of captivity itself. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was particularly harsh, and the women lacked adequate clothing, heating, or shelter. Diseases spread rapidly through the crowded detention centers: dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, killing hundreds. The Soviet authorities, stretched thin by the demands of occupying Manchuria and managing millions of prisoners and displaced persons, provided minimal resources for Japanese detainees. The women were often left to fend for themselves, creating their own systems of mutual support and care that became the only thing standing between survival and death. Watanabe Fumiko, a schoolteacher from Changchun, emerged as a leader among the women in her detention center, organizing them into groups that would pool resources, care for the sick, and maintain some semblance of order and dignity. "We couldn't control what they did to us," she wrote in letters that were later discovered by her family, "but we could control how we treated each other. We could refuse to become animals even when we were treated like animals. That small resistance, that determination to remain human, was all we had. For some of us, it was enough." The winter of 1945 descended upon Manchuria with a brutal ferocity that seemed to mirror the chaos consuming the final days of World War II. In the sprawling cities and remote settlements that dotted this contested territory, hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians had built lives under the protection of the Kwantung Army, Japan's formidable military presence in occupied Manchuria. Among them were thousands of women, nurses, teachers, telegraph operators, and families who had followed the empire's expansion into mainland Asia. They had been told they were building a new prosperity sphere, that they were civilizing the frontier. But as August 1945 arrived, everything they knew was about to shatter in ways that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 9, 1945, launching Operation August Storm, the attack came with devastating speed and overwhelming force. The Kwantung Army, once considered invincible, had been secretly weakened, its best divisions transferred to defend the home islands against the anticipated American invasion. What remained were undertrained troops, inadequate supplies, and a command structure that had been living in denial about Soviet capabilities. The Red Army poured across the border with more than 1.5 million soldiers, 5,000 tanks, and complete air superiority. Within days, Japanese defensive positions that were supposed to hold for months simply collapsed.
For the Japanese civilians scattered across Manchuria, the Soviet advance created immediate panic. Official evacuation plans existed, but they prioritized military personnel and high-ranking officials. Ordinary civilians, especially women and children, found themselves abandoned as the Kwantung Army retreated in disorder. Telegraph operator Miyamoto Haruko, then 23 years old, would later recall the moment she realized they had been left behind. "The officers told us to wait for transport that would come for us," she remembered in an interview decades later, her voice still carrying the weight of that betrayal. "We waited at the station with our small bags, watching the sky turn dark with smoke from fires in the distance. Then we saw Japanese soldiers running past us, throwing away their weapons, tearing off their uniforms. That's when we understood. No one was coming to save us." The women faced impossible choices in those chaotic days. Some attempted to flee south, toward Korea or the ports, hoping to find ships that might take them back to Japan. Others sought refuge in Chinese communities, though years of Japanese occupation had created deep wells of resentment that sometimes exploded into revenge attacks. Still others tried to hide in the countryside, watching as the world they knew burned around them. But for tens of thousands of Japanese women, capture by Soviet forces became inevitable. What followed would be a largely forgotten chapter of World War II history, a story of suffering that neither the Soviet Union nor Japan had any interest in publicizing for decades to come. The Soviet advance through Manchuria was marked by widespread violence against civilians. Red Army soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the devastation the Germans had wrought across their homeland, carried with them a rage that knew few boundaries. The concept of collective punishment seemed to govern many units' behavior. To them, all Japanese were representatives of an empire that had threatened Soviet borders for years, that had inflicted brutal defeats on Russian forces in earlier conflicts, and that deserved no mercy. Japanese women became particular targets of this fury. Sexual violence occurred on a massive scale, often with the implicit or explicit approval of Soviet commanders who saw it as a soldier's right, a spoil of war that required no justification.